Regional Center for Rural Development, and we're pleased to be hosting today's webinar on poverty and socioeconomic distress in the North Central region, assessing trends. And our presenters are Linda Lobao, Mark Partridge, and Michael Betz, all from the Ohio State University, along with Richard Go from Kansas State University. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Linda.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Rosa, and thanks to the North Central Center for Regional, North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Today, my co-presenters will be Richard Go and Mark Partridge, and Richard will be following me as soon as I complete the discussion of my section. We're going to be talking about some exploratory research that we have been doing about poverty rates in the 2000 plus decade, and today we will be presenting, let's see, sorry, get this ready. An overview of our discussion will be a brief introduction, followed by a discussion of the historical patterns of poverty across the United States, then focusing on some of the national trends in poverty and other distress in the 21st century, and then we will turn to a more detailed analysis of the North Central region during the Great Recession decade, and in that discussion, Professor Richard Go will lead that one, and then followed by challenges for the North Central region and implications for policy. That will be headed up by Mark Partridge, his section. So what we're looking at today is objective indicators of well-being, and we'll be showing a series of maps that have these measures on them. Objective indicators of well-being are well-known indicators that are collected over long periods of time by federal government and other types of secondary sources, and they're used by many government agencies to track well-being across the United States. So, for example, in the Appalachian Regional Commission, their distress index. Some of the key indicators of well-being across the United States are poverty, unemployment, and household income. And just for point of reference, for the poverty rate, and we'll be talking a lot about that today, for one-person household, that threshold is about $12,000 in 2011. And for a four-person household, that's about $23,000. One should also note that there are subjective indicators of well-being. We may want to talk about those later, but they will not really be discussed here, but we do provide information on this PowerPoint presentation about different sources that you can look at about some of the subjective indicators that have been collected during the recession. So, for example, the Pew study has found that about 85% of Americans say that it was more difficult now than it was a decade ago for middle-class people to maintain their standard of living. But I think you will see this in the maps that we will be showing you today. Again, we're focusing on the importance of objective indicators, and three of them, poverty, unemployment, and household income. Much of our analysis will focus on the poverty rate itself. This helps to simplify our discussion, and also I think you will see in the maps that we show trends for poverty are very closely reflected in trends for unemployment and median household income. So again, our focus today is a descriptive study of change, where we will document patterns and trends over time, mapping the nation. We will also get into some reasons, trying to explore some reasons why some counties fared better than others over the past decade, and then some, based on our analysis, some discussion of the challenges and potential policy directions for the North Central region. So to sort of look at these historical patterns of poverty in the couple of maps that will follow, these maps will show you the historical North-South divide in poverty in the United States that has persisted up till the present day. And keep in mind when you see these maps that there has been immense change across the United States from the post-1970s period onward, but we still see better conditions in the north. And you will see these maps of spatial clustering that I will show you that also reflect these better conditions in the north, and this includes the north central states as well. So these are some historical patterns of family poverty in the four censuses, And here merely these are terciles, or divided up into the bottom, the lowest poverty, middle poverty, and then high poverty. Again, very much of a north-south pattern, except there are certain places within the north-central regions. A lot of these seem to be Native American reservation areas where poverty historically has been higher. But for the most part in the north-central region, lower poverty. And you can see this clustering much more clearly with the low poverty clusters in the north-central region. Now let's look at one of the best decades for the United States, as well as for rural America, and this is the decade between 1990 and 2000. In this map for 1990 that you see, and we've tried to care of Mike Betz, who's created these maps, by the way. We've tried to keep the legend very much the same, so that you can see some of the transformation over time on these poverty maps. And so the red color is bad, high poverty, and the green color is good, low poverty. So here you will see in these maps that, again, very low poverty in the northern United States, and very turning to even more green. Sorry, excuse me. When we look at the 2000 era, even more green in the 2000 era, showing you the really improved socioeconomic conditions across the United States between 1990 and 2000. In fact, at this time in the year 2000, this was the first, this decade between 1990 and 2000 was the first time since 1959 that the urban-rural poverty rate gap fell below 2 percentage points. That is, historically rural areas have had higher poverty than urban areas, and conditions were so good, and particularly in rural areas, that the gap decreased dramatically to under 2%. Now we'll turn to poverty and distress during the 21st century, and of course, so if you consider about how the U.S. population was viewing the conditions that they faced over time during the 1990s, improved conditions, and then we get into the 2000 period, and then of course a dramatic shift. But this dramatic shift occurs not only really during the recession, but also is occurring in the post-2000 period overall. So we can look at the poverty rate here, and you will be seeing relatively worsened conditions over time. So here's the good map that you saw before, nice green, nice green. Okay, here we turn to, getting a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red in 2007, and then in 2010, we see the color change dramatically, and that where poverty is increasing, and poverty rate, even though it still is increasing, again, it is still lower in much of the north-central region relative to the rest of the country. And here you can see the change in the poverty rate, and again, what you see here is quite a bit of red here. This shows you poverty at the beginning 2000 period. And then at the end of that decade, so it's a percentage point change. So the percent poverty in 2010 minus the percent poverty in 2000. It shows you the growth in poverty nationally. But what's interesting here is that poverty grew relatively more in urban areas relative to rural areas, so that the gap between rural and urban America continued to actually close. In fact, it's now the smallest gap on record. The percentage points, there's only a gap of 1.6 percentage points between urban and rural poverty. So this will show you also in the maps that follow, is that poverty grew relatively more in urban areas. The rate grew relatively more in urban areas relative to rural areas. So this is the change over the decade, and then you can look at the change during the recession. And so you see, more red and more yellow and less green, and so conditions getting much worse. We'll turn very quickly to other indicators because, as I noted, the maps really will show what you have seen with poverty, but we will just note some of these here, where we see percent household, percent change in median family income, and this is just simply relative to other counties. So we see here in the north central region states like Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Ohio particularly faring worse with losing household income. And during the recession period, the same type of thing. Much of the West Coast was particularly hard hit during the recession, along with Florida and parts of the southeastern southeastern United States, as well as, again, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Ohio. This is over basically the recession years. And then unemployment, again, reflects much better conditions in the plain states. And if you look along both coasts, particularly the southeast coast of the United States and the west coast, unemployment growing. But unemployment, relatively lower compared to other places in the plains states. And the same thing during the recession. We see this again too, unemployment growing in much of the United States, except for the plain states. This is a Gini coefficient for income inequality, and because the data are not fully available for all counties, we just show you a snapshot of that. But it shows you that there was really no single causal factor implicated in income inequality, that there's a very spotty pattern here and not much in the way of systematic pattern here in terms of the change in the Gini coefficient. This is a measure of income inequality. So we're going to look very quickly at trying to explore which places fared better and which worse beyond the patterns, and ask the question why. And here what we're doing is we're drawing from research that the speakers here, presenters here at this webinar have contributed to, research and trying to understand why some places fare better and worse with regard to poverty over time. And basically, researchers identify 3 types of factors that we should be looking at about why places fare better or worse. One set is economic structure, employment quality and quantity. The other is another is demographic attributes, such as age, education, ethnicity, gender, and family structure. And these reflect residents' vulnerability to poverty. And then agglomeration factors, such as urban-rural location and distance from urban areas. These are 3 sets of factors that people often use, researchers often use when they're looking at why poverty varies from place to place. And then we operationalize these in a series of exploratory regression analyses. I call them exploratory because we're still refining them, but these so I'll be reporting upon significant findings that we find in our models, but to realize they are exploratory. They control for all other factors as much as we can, and also for the state in which the locality is. And we're looking at counties here. So basically what we find for levels of poverty, trying to determine at the end of the recession which places came out the best. Well, we found that if you had employment growth throughout the decade, your area tended to fare lower in poverty. So that we establish the importance of job growth for overall area well-being. By the way, these are lagged variables, so the independent variables here are lagged. So we're talking about what do these places look like in 2000, and then what is the outcome in terms of poverty in 2010. We also found that manufacturing and professional services, these tend to be higher quality jobs, where they were higher in 2000, there was no significant relationship with poverty subsequently. And so these economic sectors, which are among the best where people want to work, that tend to have resulted in lower poverty in the past, do not really provide a barrier to cope with economic distress in the future. And mining, we find the importance of the energy sector, where mining was higher in 2000, poverty was lower. And demographic determinants are very similar to those in the past: education and family structure being related to lower poverty, higher education, lower poverty, and then a lower proportion of single-family households and lower poverty. We also find, though, in contrast from the past, but as we know from the maps, that counties that were more distant from metro areas tended to have lower poverty rates, and this is a difference from the past, where we've had a traditional penalty of rurality. And then finally, when we're trying to analyze changes over the decade, and or changes over where the recession hit hardest, the years where it hit hardest, what we find is that employment growth was stronger at the beginning of the recession decade, we find actually worsening conditions at the end of over the recession. And so where job growth in this case was greater between years 2000 and 2007, the recession actually hit hardest. And so dynamic places where the recession was hitting. And we find that, however, contemporaneous job growth, which would be 2007 to 10, still results in reduced poverty. But my point is that early on in that decade, the most prosperous, fast-growing places actually were hit hardest by the recession. Probably not surprising to you, but where manufacturing was higher, but also food service employment, which is tends to be lower quality jobs, where these were greater, these areas experienced a greater hit from the recession. No significant relationships between professional services and poverty, which means that, basically high quality jobs didn't really provide a buffer during the recession. Neither did education really provide much of a buffer during the recession. Highly educated places generally did not fare better. We find, interestingly, that were places that had a higher proportion of single-parent male households but not female households had significantly higher poverty growth over the recession, possibly because male employment sectors were hit more, and we may be picking up more of the sex ratio or gender ratio in employment here. Areas that had younger populations experienced greater poverty or were hit more during the recession. And over age 65, less poverty growth. Agglomeration factors: larger metro counties experienced greater growth in poverty. And this is what we showed before, that the penalty of being rural is gone now, and it was the urban areas that have experienced more conditions. And so with that now, we're going to be turning to Richard, and we'll be talking about some of these same trends in more detail with maps for the North Central region. So Richard?
Thank you, Linda. I wanted to change the talk a little bit and focus specifically on the North Central region, which contains a 12-state area roughly ranging from Ohio to the Dakotas in the west, Kansas and Missouri in the south. This table, we wanted to get an idea of how did the recession affect the North Central region versus other areas of the U.S. And here was a comparison where we looked at differences between trends in the North Central region versus the rest of the country. And what we found was that the North Central region fared better than the rest of the nation in terms of poverty, household income, and unemployment. So looking at this table in 2000, you can see the poverty rate in this column is the North Central region. This is the rest of the U.S. And you can see over the decade then the poverty rate went from an average of 10.4% roughly up to about 14.2% in the region. So almost a 4 percentage point increase. And the rest of the country then went from 14.8 to 18. So the increase then, we fared relatively better. Still, the poverty rates in the rest of the U.S. is still significantly higher in 2010 compared to the North Central region. When you look at median household income at the beginning of the decade, median household income was higher within the region compared to the rest of the U.S. It had increased to 44.3 thousand compared to 42.4 roughly for the rest of the country. So again, a significant difference with conditions being better within the region. When you look at the unemployment rate, you can see that in 2000 it was roughly 3.7% within the north central region. It expanded to 8.2% in 2010. Okay, and the rest of the country was 4.6 at the beginning of the decade and went up to 9. So overall, conditions here within the region are better within the nation, or within the north central region compared to the nation as a whole. If we look at the poverty rate at the beginning of the decade in 2000, so again, the legend on this map is similar. You can see that we've shaded in metropolitan counties within the region. Up here, okay, when you look at this, okay, blue areas are actually Native American reservations. And when you look at the beginning of this decade, I think Linda mentioned that the 1990s were really a period of economic growth and prosperity within the United States. And at the end of the decade then in 2000, when you look at poverty rates across the region, again, red and orange are the bad colors where poverty rates are high, and you really see three different clusters more or less within the region where poverty rates were high. One is the Indian reservations then in the Dakotas up here. The second is southern Missouri and the boot heel of Missouri down here. Okay, a little bit also in southern Illinois. So this is Alexander County at the tip of Illinois, and over here in southern Ohio, okay, where you have the foothills of the Appalachians. All of these areas then are non-metropolitan where poverty rates are highest. When we look at poverty rates then in 2000, okay, right at the onset, beginning of the recession, you can see that during the decade poverty had expanded, and in several places where it expanded were in these similar sub areas of the region. So again, you see terrible poverty rates here in Native American reservations. When you look at the map of Missouri, you can see that counties in high poverty had spread pretty drastically, but they're all clustered in that similar part of the state, okay, including the boot heel. Okay, finally, you can also see the growth of poverty in southern Illinois. More counties had higher levels here, and then also in southern Ohio spread. Okay, what's new to this map is the fact that you begin to see clusters emerging in other parts of the region, and most specifically in north central Michigan here and in the Upper Peninsula, several counties there. Okay, by 2010, you can see even more counties experiencing greater levels of poverty, and again, some of these are in the same regions. The Indian reservation areas that I pointed to before here. Okay, again, even more counties in southern Missouri and the boot heel, and even more counties in Ohio. So this represents what's called structural change, basically where counties that had higher levels at the beginning of the decade suffered even more poverty and grew, okay, by the end of the decade. But you also begin to see high poverty spreading into new parts of the region. Here you can see in north central Michigan then even more counties receiving distress, okay, and here in the Upper Peninsula and parts of upper Wisconsin and Minnesota as well. Okay, another interesting area where poverty increased was in my state. So in southeast Kansas, you begin to see some of the counties here also begin to experience high poverty rates. When you look at where did poverty increase the most within the region over the decade, two of the most important trends in this map are that poverty increased most in several of the areas where it was most concentrated. So there you see here the Indian reservation areas again, several places in southern Missouri, but mostly you see it in the eastern part of the region. So over the course of the decade, poverty rates in counties in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin then expanded, and Minnesota expanded quite dramatically. Okay, and this was particularly the case then for counties that were either within metropolitan areas of the region, okay, or on non-metropolitan counties surrounding those metropolitan areas. Okay, so outside of the Indian reservations and eastern Kansas here, when you look at the western part of the region, you see mostly either decreases in poverty over that same time period. So there was really an uneven balance in terms of who experienced growth in poverty and which counties experienced declines in poverty. Okay, looking at this map, just a 3-year period before and in the aftermath of the recession, you can see that the trends there are largely similar. There's several important exceptions to this, and that is looking at northern Minnesota here. You see a lot more counties experiencing growth in poverty there, and Wisconsin as well. Okay, but here's another area interesting in Iowa then. So we begin to see a lot of counties across the southern part of Iowa experience high poverty rates as well. Okay, so when we looked at the determinants of poverty for the north central region, here were some of the important findings, again from regression models limited to the region only. And that is places with greater employment growth had a relative decrease in the poverty rate, okay, as found for the nation as a whole. Okay, the interesting finding for me at least was that counties that had a greater dependence on manufacturing and professional services had higher growth in the poverty rate following 2007. Okay, so when you look at the region, it contains a large swath of what used to be called the American manufacturing belt, okay, particularly in the eastern half of the region, where the majority of American manufacturing used to be concentrated at one time. So surrounding the Great Lakes, okay, across Illinois into St. Louis and that part of the country, around up to Milwaukee, that was largely where the majority of American manufacturing activity was located, and counties that were in those areas then experienced the greatest growth in poverty. What we haven't really teased out yet is why that was the case and what the connection might be, if any, to manufacturing activity. You know, it's possible then that what happened to manufacturing during those years didn't have anything to do with the change in poverty rate, but it seems to me like we've undergone a deindustrialization of this area since roughly the end of the 1970s, and so it will be interesting to try to link that a little bit more closely to what happened to the change in poverty. We also found that the closer to large metropolitan areas a county was had higher growth in poverty in that post-recession period, and those with a higher proportion of associate degree had actually a decrease in poverty. Okay, so this could deal with the linking then of community colleges with new jobs in America. So we hear quite a bit about how American workers aren't really prepared for today's jobs, and that community colleges then maybe work better in terms of training workers for the new jobs, and we might be picking up that particular relationship with that. Okay, finally we found that there's a little relationship with other common determinants of poverty, and so this poverty in the post-2007 period seems to be different from what we've experienced earlier. Okay, now I also want to talk now a little bit about median household income. Okay, this largely mirrors the trend that Linda discussed earlier, and so when you look at where did household income grow within the region, again you can see in the eastern part of the region here, particularly in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and parts of eastern Wisconsin, you can see that median income grew the least, and green then, light green and yellow are higher growth rates, and you can see the western part of the region fared much better, okay, particularly looking at North Dakota, interestingly, had some of the highest rates of median income. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, following in this recession period, then you can see again similar trends. Okay, so the eastern part, counties in the eastern part of the region here experienced the least amount of growth in median household income, and counties in the western part fared much better outside of those that are close to or within Native American reservations. Okay, unemployment, okay, largely mirrors the same trend. Again, you see highest rates of growth in unemployment in the eastern part of the region here in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Okay, and we actually had low increases in unemployment in the states in the western part of the region. Okay, finally, singling out unemployment in the recession period, you can see very similar trend. Okay, so again, high growth rates and unemployment in the east, okay, low growth rates in the western states of the region. Okay, one exception to this is counties in Illinois then experienced a much greater increase, and parts of Missouri here surrounding St. Louis experienced a much greater increase, a severe jump in unemployment following the recession. Okay, to sum this up, the western states within the north central region tended to fare better in both poverty, median household income, and unemployment over the course of the decade. And I think that what we're seeing in the Dakotas are the likely booms in commodity-based industries. Energy, for example, appear to be visible in our data, so points of prosperity for the present. Okay, finally, counties where manufacturing employment was higher and counties closer to the large cities fared worse. So the problem with our analysis is that we can't strictly prove that it was further decline in manufacturing that resulted in higher poverty. That will require some additional evidence beyond what we have here. But it will be interesting to figure out why that's related. Okay, so with that, I would like to turn the discussion over to Mark to talk about the policy implications of all of this.
Well, thank you. What I'm going to try to do is probably by far the least precise part of the discussion, but hopefully will inspire some thinking about some policy implications and what can be done to mitigate poverty. I just want to note that, you know, in motivating this, one of the things that I did is in 2006 I co-authored a book, The Geography of American Poverty, where we boldly put forward some ideas for reducing poverty. And what I want to note about that is that though I think the analysis was wonderful, it seems quite quaint now if we look after the Great Recession, that a lot of what we said wouldn't really apply to today. And you know, I'll talk a little bit about that. You know, some of the some of the massive structural changes and challenges we face in reducing poverty. As was noted, you know, this region faces some well-known challenges. You know, parts of the region, large parts of the region, lacks the natural amenities that historically have attracted people, though that is changing. Some of the northern regions with its forested landscapes have become more appealing. It's been called you know, the Rust Belt, an old industrial region, and in some extent that to me was the most surprising part of our descriptive analysis that Richard and Linda presented. Was that, sure, I know that manufacturing is more important in the north and in the east part, the East Great Lakes, the manufacturing belt, but I was surprised that its share of the economy was much smaller at the beginning of the Great Recession than, say, what it was in the late 1960s. And so I was surprised at what a legacy it still has in terms of poverty, illustrating how important manufacturing is still to this day in helping in the lower half of the income distribution. It plays such an important part of that, even though it's a much smaller part of the economy, illustrated as manufacturing continues to suffer or maybe benefit from productivity increases, fewer workers there, that we still have challenges of how we're going to lift people into the middle class and falling from poverty. Then as Richard went through and Linda went through, you know, it's really stark how the Great Plains did, how much better the Great Plains did since 2000. Now, some of this is that the Great Plains has always been real unique. You can go back to the 1930s, and North Dakota had the lowest unemployment rates then, and it has the lowest unemployment rates today, and it always has the lowest unemployment rates all the way down the Great Plains. But it seemed to more overperform than what it historically did. You know, some of this is we have this strong commodity cycle where, you know, in central Great Plains and western Nebraska, you have a strong farm economy. In the southern parts of the Great Plains and in northwestern North Dakota, you see the real strong oil development. But but we know those regions are now much more exposed to the boom-bust cycle that you get. That certainly times are really good during the boom, but the bust will be really hard. And the way that will manifest itself historically is people will leave the region. So the point is we still face these real challenges. In particular, the one is in the eastern Great Lakes, how manufacturing shows a strong legacy effect that I said would have surprised me. I would not have thought that it still had that before the Great Recession. So what are some of the policy fixes? And this is where, given that we're giving descriptive evidence, this gets where we're pushing our results a little too far, perhaps. But I think we have some evidence that we can pull from the literature that we can use place-based policy, and we can use human capital investment. But I think increasingly we need to be thinking about human capital investment a little bit different. I think Richard pointed out real nicely that a long-term result has been, going back, back to the 1990s, that an associate's degree and those kinds of, post-high school education for a large share of our workforce is the route to into the middle class, and yet it receives virtually no policy attention. And so that's one area. The other is in terms of human capital investment, is that pre-K childhood investment pays incredible returns. There's large literature on that, but of course young children don't vote. So, and the other issue is sure that's going to be effective in the long term, but it's not going to be effective in the next 15 years in terms of economic outcomes. In terms of place-based policy, I should have some caveats about that. That's investments for particular places given their particular characteristics. I should note that one is not every place is going to benefit from place-based policy, and two is that this is something that the public really doesn't want to take on, and politicians certainly don't want to acknowledge it because they're looking at the next election. There's no short-term fix to any of these kinds of issues. So what can we say about place-based policy? Well, one is helping particular places tends to play a bigger role today than what it did, say, in the 1990s or in the 20th century, in the sense that migration responsiveness to economic shocks has greatly decreased. Even before the Great Recession, people were much less likely to pick up and move to where there was economic opportunity. That means the conditions in their local community matter more than ever because now they're there. Now people are staying there. They're more affected by that. So in that sense, getting it right at the local and regional level becomes much more important when people don't pick up and move. And the other factor is that on the positive side of place-based policy, we get better effects in remote locations. Some of the work me and my co-authors in the past is we've shown that remote locations, you have fewer people moving in if you do successfully create opportunity, and you have fewer commuters coming in. Of course, there might be more costs in those regions, but so there are arguments that we could put forward saying, hey, place-based policies can work under certain conditions. And I just want to note that one area that academics like to point to and politicians will say without putting any resources there, small business development seems to have high returns, though acknowledging that not everybody should be in business, but places that have more business development, even if you account for their economic conditions, seem to do better. And then finally, when I talk about place-based policy, I'm not talking about something we as academics really frown upon, and that's more tax incentives where where money is given to footloose companies, hoping that will save everything. In the sense that they might have done that anyway. They're going to pick up and move, and it shifts resources. When you give somebody a tax break, either you have to raise taxes on everybody else or cut services, making the broader economy less competitive. So when I talk about place-based policy, I'm talking about targeted education and infrastructure investments, working with small business development and so forth, less about trying to pick winners with firms because the track record isn't particularly good there. So one of the things that stands out that we're putting forward, we've put forward, especially Linda Lobao, also myself working with her and Richard, is that one role is places that have better local governments, stronger local governments, tended to fare better. Now, obviously, we know that places with stronger economies have fewer local government cutbacks, but the argument that we make is the places that continue to make their investments, after we account for the strength of their economy, did pretty well. And this is a map that shows the association I just said. We still haven't got causation there, but we see, again, I acknowledge the association. All I am talking about is association. Places that did better also had less cutbacks in local government. Again, more work has to, how much of that was the general economy versus how much of that was strong, healthy local governments led to better outcomes. But that would be one of the things that we're actually working on right now is, what is the role of local government, local government capacity and able to do things for their local community in playing better, resulting in better economic outcomes. So one of the things is in the North Central region that stood out from Linda's and Richard's discussion. If you go back into the 20th century, from Iowa east in this region, you had really nice economic outcomes, wealthier and everything. That changed. The western part of the region began to fare well. Question is, the big question is how much of that is due to a commodity boom, say in Kansas South and in northwestern North Dakota, and then in farming and agriculture, and say in the central Great Plains, and how much of that is some sort of permanent change. Likewise, manufacturing is going to be, it remains a difficult challenge. I mean, we could find a handful of industries that might benefit from lower natural gas prices, but most of them are competing mostly on the basis of labor costs across manufacturing. That requires significant productivity gains to be competitive internationally, but that means employing fewer workers. So very difficult, our traditional base, say in the eastern Great Lakes region, is going to probably face continued stress. So in that sense is how do we build stronger communities? And again, I think the more the focus is on small business development, trying to build within, trying to build the kind of people that will make a region successful, building the kind of entrepreneurial climate that will make a region successful, rather than trying to pick the particular industries, because a lot of the industries, they're going to struggle, but if we have the right people, the growing industries will want to come to us. So on that basis, I will thank everybody for participating, and my previous presenters also want to thank, and I think I'll turn it over to our moderator where we have some questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a great overview of what you guys have been doing. Guest has a number of questions there, so maybe just take a moment and look at those. And maybe Linda can answer that one. And while Linda's thinking about that question, I have one for Richard and maybe some of the others too, and that is, and maybe Mark. At what point do these more sparsely populated areas, particularly in the western part of the region, at what point do they sort of get to a tipping point where the population has declined to the extent where it's just impossible to deliver services in that area? You got they close a small school, and so therefore people have to bus their kids a really long way to get there, and people don't want to move there because they got to bus the kids, and on and on. At what point does that start to happen?
Scott, are you asking me, or which one to answer that question, or?
I was thinking that you could look at the guests' questions while I.
Oh, I see the guests' questions.
Yeah.
But where are the guest questions? I don't know.
In the chat box down here.
Chat box. I don't see anything in mine. Nothing's listed in mine. Sorry. Oh, that's everyone. Okay, sorry. All right. Oh, sustainable food system. Oh, I see. Okay.
So econometrically, Mark,
oh, I see.
Scott, I'll jump on your answer. Okay, your question. I think you raised a really important question, and I kind of danced around that question. But not everywhere is going to could have successful place-based policy, and certainly prior to the Great Recession, the evidence was pretty clear. It seemed that if you look at the western part of the Great Plains region, that a lot of those places had crossed a tipping point, and we're going to struggle. We're seemingly the lack of services, the lack of access to cities. It was going to be really difficult, say, for outside of a handful of farmers and everything. And since then, as we've shown, that region's greatly benefited from a commodity boom. And I guess the question is how much of that is just a short-term commodity boom and that's covering up these long-term problems of, you say, a lack of capacity, too, sparse population that can't maintain an adequate level of public services, and starting a vicious cycle where people start to leave. I think that's a really good question after this commodity boom ends. I would have said we'd reached it before the Great Recession, and now that we've seen a little bit bounce back, I think we have to wait a little bit.
So your modeling doesn't have any dynamics in it at this point to be able to kind of start to answer those questions? At which point, kind
Well,
of sort of, have you looked at population density in some of your modeling exercises?
well, yes, absolutely. We've looked at all this. What I'm worried about, one of the things when I talk to people, is that I've argued that there's been a large structural change across the entire economy, and especially the geography of where the spatial implications of where people are and where workers are and everything. And so in that sense, I'm wondering if a lot of the structural relationships in the past, our modeling suggested those regions were too sparsely populated. Does that apply now after a big structural change? So that's what I'm getting at.
Linda, have you had a chance to digest all those questions from guests?
Oh, I said that one. Well, I can just see one question on there about what impact has local zoning played in rural poverty, people with little money, what's happening with zoning and how that's affecting community quality of life. And I mean, yeah, potentially, I mean, that is affecting community quality of life. What is the impact at the community level of changes that are occurring and taking away people's livelihood strategies, potentially because of zoning, because they can't raise small animals or engage in the kinds of businesses that they might want to have. We are not able to answer that question, though, however, in the kind of data that we have, although I will point you to some studies of the informal sector economy that are being done, I know by Ann Tickmeyer and Leif Jensen at Penn State, that would be looking more at the informal sector, because essentially we would call these types of activities household livelihood strategies, and the degree to which zoning is impacting those. And again, I think this is something that is more at the sub-county level, relative to the analyses that we're looking at right now. And I can, just tell you that from our own area, even in a fairly urbanized part of Ohio, there are all sorts of fights and issues in local communities about should we be raising chickens, outside in chicken coops and this sort of thing as well. So I think it extends pretty far into the region, and not just to the rural parts, but to the urban parts as well. But again, this really isn't a question that I could answer given our data, but I would point you to some of the work that's being done at Penn State on the informal sector.
So it seems like you could include that in modeling by, some kind of variable like the percentage of land that's is in zoned areas or something like that, to maybe look at it econometrically.
And how that would affect poverty rates. Well, one of the things we do have is local government capacity. So if you put in, we have that's a good point, Scott. We do have actually a published paper that just recently came out on the impacts of county governments and does capacity impact poverty. And as Mark was saying, we tend to find that some of the capacity indicators do seem to affect poverty. So we have stronger local governments, because zoning would be to me a measure of capacity, strength of local government to be able to plan for the future. And we find a little bit of evidence, not so much of zoning again, but of the general capacity issue. We do have zoning. We do have county officials' reports of zoning at the county level, however.
And I put up the summary webinar evaluation, so if folks could click away on that, that would be great. I think people are maybe putting in a few more questions there. I want to go back to that last map. There was one state that looked pretty stunning there. I don't know if everybody else on the webinar noticed that, but what's going on with that one? Let me go back to right here. So. Have you looked at that? I mean, it just seems incredible.
We've just actually created those maps. They're pretty much hot off the press for everybody here, and this is a special EMSI data that private company produced, and we're looking at total local governments. It includes school districts, counties, all local governments, and yeah, very, very striking in the declines that we see. And so, yeah, so your question is yeah, why we don't see that, Wyoming, yeah. And we're guessing, potentially the energy boom, but Mark, you may have some thoughts about that, because Mark and I have discussed this.
Right, I'm sure it's state government fund, severance tax revenues supporting our local governments, the state government funding. But right, you definitely see Texas and Oklahoma and North Dakota really standing out. Where we've seen more of a stronger energy boom. You'd really see them standing out, faring better in terms of employment.
Yeah, and so you don't think it was really a policy change? It's just that the government is flush?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think that's what we think. Yeah.
Okay. So
right. I don't think in that case. I agree. It probably was that state was probably not a big policy change. It was more they had high tax revenues that could support local government.
Okay. Jan Flora had a question about population change. You want to?
Yeah. I don't know about that. That's possibly true. I was trying to look at the ERS reports about the population change between 2010 and 2011, but our data for poverty data stops at 2010, so I don't know if that's the case. But I don't know if do you know that, Mark, at all, or whether the
I
changes? Yeah.
I don't know that. But though I'm not surprised in the sense that during the recession, the rural areas fared better. So then during the the recovery, that there'd be a little bit more of a bounce back in the urban areas.
Yeah. Okay. So, so overall, so total population has declined in non-metro, I think, is what Jan was saying.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I mean, I think that's what we've seen. I mean, I think that's what we've been reading about, but we don't have the data on that. And then the question about oil states did better, and I don't know.
I think Michael was probably reacting to the map. My question about the map on that one.
I see. Yeah.
So you've got the kind of western North Dakota here, and then Idaho. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really a fascinating map. Of course, it's easy to explain in the eastern part of the region, but the western part is and beyond it's I wasn't aware of those changes, so that's really fascinating. Uh-huh. Well, doesn't look like anybody else is typing, so I think we can turn off the recording and say thanks to our presenters. Very interesting set of slides to think about, and we'll look forward to more coming out of this project.